Hey, David Brewster here, new episode of Chordplay. This is the Chords of Cactus, and I've had some requests to feature this legendary but obscure and commonly overlooked band. Very essential and important and influential. Cactus formed in New York in 1969, and originally it was going to be Carmen Appice and Tim Bogert from Vanilla Fudge. They were going to pair up with Jeff Beck and Rod Stewart and form a band, and that's what Cactus was supposed to be. But then Jeff Beck was in a car accident, and he took a year off. And then they formed Cactus instead with Rusty Day on vocals and Jim McCarty on guitar. Definitely a kick-ass, powerhouse, blues rock, heavy rock, band. Essential. So Cactus was definitely a supergroup with Carmen Appice and Tim Bogert, who worked with Vanilla Fudge. And eventually they did work with Jeff Beck, after Cactus. And Rusty Day, he worked with Amboy Dukes, with Ted Nugent. Also worked with Steve Gaines before Steve, worked with Lynyrd Skynyrd. And of course, I just mentioned, Jim McCarty. Jim McCarty worked with a bunch of different people and continues to stay active. But here's kind of the background as far as this supergroup from the 70s. So in the guitar department, as far as the original run of Cactus, I've already mentioned Jim McCarty, a great guitarist, powerhouse, heavy riffs and these knockout, chord moments and fuzzed out solos with effects and stuff, and just totally rocking out. And then also a softer side too, with clean guitar and acoustic guitar stuff. Very interesting guitarist, also worked with Buddy Miles, Mitch Ryder, a group called the Rockets. But yeah, definitely, Jim McCarty's a great guitarist. So the chord-based and rhythm guitar parts in this episode came from 3 Cactus albums, and I'm basically pulling from their original run. The band had 3 runs, 69 to 72, 76 to 79, and then 2006 until now. And in that time they released 8 studio albums, 2 live albums, 7 compilations, but we're going to mainly stick with those original 3 albums featuring Jim McCarty on guitar. So if you're a Cactus fan, buckle up, here we go. With the opening, that's the song Evil from the album Restrictions, and that's an old Willie Dixon cover, and they just completely rocked it out. Something like this. Something like that. So it's a blues in D, and bang these 2, D5 power chords, and then a big D slide right there. And then the riff. Right? So like that D 3 times, and then shake that F twice. G 3 times. Shake that A twice. So bang that D chord again, and do the riff again. Bang the D chord again, do the riff. One more time on that riff. Then right there, go to a G, right, to the 4 chord, and then do the riff. Kind of a mutation or a variation of what we had before. And then back to D. And right there, it's going to extend to A, the 5 chord. You're going to do the G riff, but in A right here. And then do the G riff. And then back to D again. And then right there, you're going to basically take it up another octave right there. And then start the whole thing over again. kicks ass. Next up's the riff from the song Bro Bill from the first Cactus album, and this isn't really so much rocking out, it's real swampy and laid back, but that's why I grabbed it, because it's really cool. Something like this. Hard to play, it's just cool, and it starts with this real old-time kind of slide, or at least that's what I'm hearing in there, that F to G with the open D and G string ringing, and then do it again, and then some steep cropper kind of sixths, like that, double 5, double 7, double 5, and then that 4-3 like for part of G right there, and then you've got this real lazy so you're literally going, think G or G7. So the minor to major third, that B flat to B, and then that G and grab that F note over there on the B string. And then double stops, and like that kind of bluesy, hammer on pull off trill right there. And then an F to G kind of lazy. Not hard to play, just really cool, and I love those swampy, bluesy riffs. Cool stuff. Next up's the opening to You Can't Judge a Book by the Cover, and this is from the first Cactus album, and yet another Willie Dixon cover. And this is, once again, not really that hard to play, it's just this simple kind of arpeggiated chord, but it's interesting. Something like this. Something like that. So it's just a little part of E7 right there, and they're picking backward through it. So that's kind of the first pattern. And then you hear that walk up D to that D sharp, and then it starts again. And then the second time, just play that high E open, and then do that D to D sharp, walk up again, and then just repeat that pattern like this. Not hard to play, just interesting, and definitely that's a great cover of that song too, so check that out. Next up's the rock out riff from Feel So Good from the first Cactus album, and it's something like this. So we're in E, and it starts with a slide off on that E note right there, and then you're playing with an E minor 7 right there. Think the Hendrix chord, but we're not playing that G sharp. Move it back to a G natural like that. E minor 7, like that. So you're gonna slide off, hit the low E open, play the bottom part of the chord, and then the top part. Like that. And then you've got this, and that's interesting. So it's E, open G, that A note, slide that A to B, and also play the open B string. Like that. And then you're going to slide up and do the riff again. And then this G to G sharp, high E open. And then the riff changes, like the rhythm, and you're doing... So that's the E minor 7, that slide into that B note, the G to G sharp, the high E open, and then a G to A power chord after that. Interesting song, and that rhythm's interesting too. Cool. Next up's the song Let Me Swim from the first Cactus album, and the intro to this song might sound familiar because this was an influence on Eddie Van Halen and the opening of Eruption. And at the beginning of Let Me Swim, you're going to hear an A power chord and then a lead lick, and then an A to a G to a D power chord, and then more lead licks, you know, something like this. Lead licks, and then that A, G to D. Right? And eventually when the chord riff starts, you're doing... keeps going. So after the opening, that A and then the A, G, D, you start doing this real bouncy, kind of reminds me of Rock and Roll by Led Zeppelin and a bunch of other songs, but that bouncy riff in A between that A6 and A7 like that. Then eventually you hear this E7 right there. Right, like the low E open, the fretted part, then the two top strings open, the B and the high E. And then it's like that D note, bend and release that A, grab that G, and then do a 14th fret double stop there. And then do that E7 again. And then E major pentatonic here. Like that. And then do the E7 again. The first lick again, and then that E7 again, and it's kind of chromatic, right? Like the D, D sharp, E, G, G sharp, A, C to D, and it goes right back to that A riff. Interesting song, and definitely the connection to like the beginning of Eruption's really interesting and historic too. Great song, Let Me Swim. Next up's the title track from the album One Way or Another with the song One Way or Another, and this kicks ass, something like this. Something like that. So we're in D, we're going to slide off this D note, grab this F into that D right there, shake it with some vibrato and pick it again. And you're going to hop down, grab this F, you know, kind of add some vibrato and sustain that note. And then this F sharp to G, and then slide that G into A, grab C, and then go back to A. Right? And then repeat that. And last time right there, you're going to go up to this higher C. So that C, you're going to roll back, like think the blues scale there, that A flat to G. Shift back to that F and then G to D. So that's kind of tricky there at the end. After you introduce that top part, then you start going back and forth. You do the low one first, then the higher one second, and you just kind of go back and forth. When that runs its course, then you got a G power chord to a B flat. This is the part that reminds me of Van Halen. Then this D, C, D, F. And then that ends on an A power chord right there. Something like that. Definitely a kick-ass song. Okay, last but not least is the song Restrictions from the album by the same name. And this really isn't hard to play. It's just interesting to notice what Jim did with this different assortment of chords. Something like this. Like I said, it's not hard to play. It's just interesting to notice like this assortment of different chords and different voicings of chords. So it starts with B flat, then you're moving up to that F, and then a double stop there, 8th fret, and then end on that C note, like that. And then do it again. And then it gets real quiet right there. It's C major to F major to E flat major, right? And then like he started on this C, right? And then this F to that E flat major, and then you distinctly hear him move to this C after that, like that, and do it again, the C to the F to the E flat, and then you hear it get loud again, go to the B flat, F, and then it's like an E flat over F right there. Then that B flat to F to a E flat, and then you hear this G, F, E flat, and then you go back to that C, F, E flat again. Not hard to play. It's just really interesting to notice like the way he's changing, you know, like the same chord but he's using a different voicing. And I do that a lot in my own music, and then noticing him doing that, it's like, hey, that's pretty cool to grab C here and then you're suddenly playing C there. You know what I mean? And just kind of changing things around on the fretboard, which keeps things interesting. All right, that's going to wrap this episode of Chordplay with this look at the Chords of Cactus. Definitely a very interesting and unique and inspiring band for sure, and their influence was everywhere. Even though they didn't really explode in popularity, I mean, they very well could have been as big as Led Zeppelin. But, you know, I guess it just really wasn't in the cards and it didn't happen that way. But their music, you know, definitely a lot of people point to, you know, Led Zeppelin, the early hard rock, the early heavy metal stuff. Cactus was right there with them, and I think that might have basically impacted their exposure or their popularity. Because you got to remember, back in the day, in the late 60s, when people heard Led Zeppelin, they lost their minds. You know, they'd never heard music like that. It sounded like a bomb going off. And then you have Cactus, which in my opinion were just a smidge, you know, heavier, if that's even possible. And I think it just confused people, and they were like, whoa, this is too much. But then you fast forward a few years, I mean, obviously they had fans and they had a fan base, but I think it took a little while. They were definitely way ahead of the curve and made music, you know, ahead of their time, in my opinion. But that's why I think this is so great to go back and listen and learn, you know, from some music like this. So anyway, leave some feedback and comments. Please subscribe to Nail Lessons, and I'll be back before you know with more content and material. Thank you.